Imagine for a moment feeling the bitter ice of the Nordic wind on your face, the weight of a battle axe in your hands, and the adrenaline coursing through your veins as you enter a state of almost supernatural rage that made even the most seasoned warriors tremble with fear. This isn't just a fantasy, this was the reality of the Viking Berserkers, legendary warriors who entered battle in a mystical trance that transformed them into something beyond the ordinary human. But what did it really mean to live as a berserker? What was it like to wake up each day knowing that your own mind could become both your greatest weapon and your greatest danger? Today, we'll delve deep into this fascinating and dark world, exploring not only the lives of the berserkers themselves, but also other forgotten stories that will reveal surprising aspects of Norse culture that few know. If you're as fascinated by these stories lost in time as I am, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me what time you're watching this video. I love knowing when you're here with me exploring these mysteries of the past. To truly understand what it meant to be a berserker, we must first understand that these were not simply savage warriors as they are often portrayed in popular culture. The term berserker derives from bearsark, meaning bear shirt, a reference to the bear skins many of these warriors wore in battle. But there were also the ulfhenir, the wolf warriors, who dressed in wolf skins and channeled the fierce spirit of these predators. Your life began long before you first donned a sacred animal skin. From a young age, if you were chosen to follow the path of the berserker, your education would be radically different from that of other Viking children. While other young men learned primarily about agriculture, trade, or crafts, you would be trained in special combat techniques, but more importantly, in spiritual and mental practices that would allow you to achieve the state of controlled rage known as berserkergang. This training began with purification rituals, prolonged fasting, and deliberate exposure to extreme cold to strengthen not only your body, but also your mind. Your master, a veteran berserker scarred by countless battles, would teach you to commune with the animal spirit that would become your source of power. This was not a simple or quick process. It could take years of daily practice, involving deep meditation, the controlled use of plants with mind-altering properties, and complex rituals that connected you to the primordial forces of nature. You would learn to recognize the physical signs that preceded trance, the rise in body temperature, the dilation of your pupils, the roar that began deep in your throat. During your formative years, you would live isolated from ordinary society, usually in small groups of other aspiring berserkers, under the supervision of experienced masters. Your diet would be strictly controlled, consisting primarily of raw meat and fresh blood, foods believed to help awaken animal instincts. You would sleep outdoors even during the harshest winters, using only animal skins for protection, developing a superhuman resistance to the cold. That would become one of your distinguishing characteristics. The physical training was brutal and relentless. You would fight other aspirants using real, not simulated weapons, resulting in genuine injuries that were considered a necessary part of the hardening process. You would learn to fight not just with axes and swords, but with your bare hands and teeth, developing a ferocity that could be terrifying even to your allies. Most importantly, you would learn to channel your pain and transform it into fuel for your rage. At 15 or 16, if you survived training, you would undergo an initiation ritual that would test not only your physical prowess, but also your ability to enter the berserker state under extreme pressure. This ritual, performed during the darkest winter nights, involved a solitary hunt in which you were to track and kill a bear or wolf, using only primitive weapons. The animal you killed would provide the pelt you would wear for the rest of your life as a berserker, and its spirit would become your permanent spiritual guide. Once accepted as a full-fledged berserker, your life would change dramatically. You would no longer be considered fully human by Viking society. You would exist in a unique position, respected and feared at the same time. During times of peace, you would live on the fringes of society, often in small groups with other berserkers, supporting yourself through hunting and occasional work as a bodyguard for wealthy jarls or merchants who needed protection on dangerous journeys. But it was during times of war that your true nature emerged. When a jarl or king summoned his berserkers to battle, You would transform into something that transcended the normal limits of human experience. The process of entering the Berserker gang was a ritual in itself. It would begin hours before battle, with fasting and deep meditation. You would consume certain sacred plants known only to Berserkers, substances that altered your perception and increased your resistance to pain. As the battle approached, you would begin to feel the physical changes. Your body temperature would rise dramatically, causing you to sweat profusely even in the Arctic cold. Your breathing would become rapid and shallow, your heart pounding like a war drum. Your muscles would contract involuntarily, and you would begin to growl and howl like the animal whose spirit you channeled. Your eyes would become red and bloodshot, your pupils dilated to the point where there was barely any visible iris. When you finally entered the full Berserker gang state, you would lose almost all sense of yourself as an individual. You would become pure fury incarnate, a force of nature that moved across the battlefield, leaving nothing but destruction in your wake. Your resistance to pain would increase to superhuman levels. Injuries that would incapacitate normal warriors you wouldn't even feel. Your physical strength would increase dramatically, allowing you to shatter shields with your bare hands and strike down multiple opponents at once. During this state, you would feel no fear, pity, or any normal human emotion. You would attack enemies, allies, and even inanimate objects indiscriminately if they stood in your way. This was why other Viking warriors often kept their distance from Berserkers during battle, even if they were on the same side. Stories tell of Berserkers who, at the height of their rage, bit their own shield edges until their teeth broke, or who tore their own clothes and skin in their thirst for violence. The Berserker state could last from a few minutes to several hours, depending on the intensity of the battle and the warrior's experience. When it finally passed, you would collapse in complete exhaustion, often remaining unconscious for hours. Upon awakening, you would have little or no memory of what you had done during the trance. Others would have to tell you about your deeds, and often these stories would include acts of violence so extreme that they would horrify even a society accustomed to the brutality of war. This post-Berserker amnesia was both a blessing and a curse. On the one hand, it spared you the psychological burden of remembering every act of violence you committed. On the other, it meant you could never be sure what you had done, creating constant anxiety about the consequences of your actions. Many Berserkers developed a deep fear of themselves, knowing they carried within them a force they could not fully control. A Berserker's daily life between battles was marked by this constant tension. They would practice mind control techniques daily to avoid entering the Berserker state unintentionally. Minor provocations that wouldn't bother a normal person could trigger partial transformations, resulting in outbursts of violence that terrorized local communities. For this reason, many Berserkers preferred to live in isolation, visiting settlements only when necessary to trade furs and meat for tools and other supplies. Their personal relationships would inevitably be complicated by their dual nature. While some Viking women were attracted to the Berserkers' status and power, others avoided them altogether, fearing for their own safety. Raising a family was extremely difficult, as the risk of losing control and harming loved ones was ever present. Many Berserkers remained single throughout their lives, finding companionship only among others of their kind. As you grew older, controlling the Berserker state would become even more difficult. Veteran Berserkers often developed a form of dementia, precox, possibly related to the repeated brain trauma caused by intense trances and prolonged use of mind-altering substances. Some became permanently trapped in a semi-Berserker state, unable to function normally in society and eventually being ostracized or killed by their own communities. A Berserker's death rarely came in old age. Most died young, whether in battle, in duels with other Berserkers, or in accidents caused by loss of control. Those who survived to old age often chose ritual suicide, preferring to die with honor rather than live as shadows of their former selves. A Berserker's funeral was a solemn and feared event, as it was believed that the spirit of such a fierce warrior would not rest easily. But the Berserkers were only one facet of the complex Viking society. There were many other forgotten stories that reveal fascinating aspects of this culture. For example, few know about the Veljur, female shamans who possessed prophetic powers and were consulted even by the most powerful kings. These women lived even more isolated lives than the berserkers, traveling from community to community practicing a type of magic known as sire. The Velir were simultaneously revered and feared, as they were believed to be able to see through the veil of time and foresee future events. Their appearance was distinctive. They wore blue robes decorated with precious stones, carried magical staffs made of iron and bone, and often had white hair even in their youth, a result of their intense magical practices. During their prophecy sessions, they would enter deep trances similar to those of berserkers, but instead of violence, they would channel mystical knowledge. Another forgotten story is the Viking traders known as fjords, men who dedicated their lives to trading voyages that took them as far as the markets of Constantinople and Baghdad. These were not the violent raiders often portrayed in popular media, but skilled diplomats and shrewd negotiators who established trade routes that connected Scandinavia to the rest of the known world. Their voyages lasted years, and many never returned home, settling permanently in distant lands. The fjords developed their own unique subculture within Viking society. They spoke multiple languages, were versed in diverse religious and social customs, and often served as informal ambassadors between different cultures. Their homes, upon their eventual return to Scandinavia, were veritable museums of exotic artifacts collected during their travels. Spices from the East, silks from Byzantium, Arabian silver, and slaves from distant lands passed through their hands. There were also the skald, poet historians, whose job was to preserve history and legend through complex and elaborate verses. These men possessed prodigious memories, capable of reciting hundreds of epic poems without making a single mistake. Their position in society was almost sacred, as they were the guardians of the collective memory of the Norse people. A talented skald could gain the protection of powerful kings and live a life of relative luxury, but the pressure to never forget a verse or make a mistake in their recitations was immense. The skald developed incredibly complex poetic forms, with rhyme schemes and meters that defy modern comprehension. Their poems were not merely entertainment, but accurate historical records disguised in poetic language. Through elaborate metaphors and mythological references, they managed to preserve information about battles, royal genealogies, and important events with an accuracy that rivals formal written records. One of the most intriguing and least known practices of Viking culture was the holmganga, formal duels that served not only to settle disputes, but also as a form of social justice. These duels had extremely specific rules and were considered divine judgments, where the gods would decide the outcome through combat. The holmganga could be initiated by any free man against another, regardless of social class, creating a system where even a poor farmer could challenge a wealthy jarl. The rules of holmganga were extremely ritualized. The duel would take place on a small island or a plot of land marked specifically for this purpose. Each combatant could bring 3 shields, and when all were destroyed, the duel would continue with swords only. The first to bleed was declared the loser, unless the bleeding was caused by a foot injury from stepping outside the marked area, in which case they would be considered a coward. Interestingly, there was an alternative to physical combat in the holmganga. The challenged party could choose to pay a substantial fine to the challenger rather than fight. This option allowed older or less physically able men to avoid combat without completely losing their honor, though it would cost a significant financial price. However, refusing to either fight or pay resulted in permanent banishment from society. Another fascinating aspect of Viking culture were the berserkjäger, seasonal festivals where berserkers from different clans gathered not for war, but for ritual competitions and the exchange of knowledge. These events took place during the solstices and equinoxes, connecting natural cycles with warrior traditions. During these festivals, young berserkers could learn from veterans. New trance-inducing techniques were shared, and alliances between different groups were formed or renewed. Berserkjäger also served as opportunities for berserkers to find suitable mates, as only particularly strong and courageous women were considered suitable companions. These women, known as berserkerskona, were warriors in their own right, though they followed slightly different traditions than their male counterparts. They often specialized in combat with bows and spears, complementing the melee nature of traditional berserkers. Viking religiosity was far more complex than popular representations suggest. In addition to the well-known gods like Odin and Thor, there were hundreds of lesser deities, local spirits, and supernatural entities that influenced daily life. Every family had its own ancestral spirits, every forest had its magical creatures, and every spring or stone could harbor supernatural forces that needed to be respected and appeased. Viking religious rituals varied dramatically across regions and eras, but typically involved complex offerings that could include food, valuable objects, animals, and, on special occasions, human sacrifices. These sacrifices were not random barbaric acts, but carefully orchestrated ceremonies with profound religious significance. Those chosen for sacrifice were often volunteers, who believed they were earning a special place in Valhalla through their ritual death. One of the most striking aspects of Viking society was the role of women, who enjoyed far greater rights and freedoms than their counterparts in other European cultures of the time. Viking women could own property, initiate divorces, represent themselves in legal matters, and even serve as religious and political leaders. The figure of the Husfreyja, the lady of the house, was respected and powerful, often making important decisions regarding family finances and political alliances. There were also shield maidens, female warriors who fought alongside men in battle. Although less common than male warriors, these women were treated with equal respect on the battlefield and could rise to leadership positions based solely on their military skill. Some of the most famous Viking leaders were women, including queens who commanded entire fleets on raiding expeditions across Europe. Viking navigation was an art that combined advanced technical knowledge with almost supernatural intuition. Viking navigators, known as styrimar, developed ocean navigation techniques that allowed them to explore and colonize areas as far away as Greenland and possibly even North America. These men could determine their position in the ocean using only the stars, the movement of the waves, the behavior of seabirds, and even the taste of the seawater. The styrimar were near mythical figures within Viking society, surrounded by legends about their ability to feel land through water and find invisible islands amidst the vast ocean. Their training began in childhood and involved years of study, not only of practical navigation techniques, but also of mythology and oral traditions that contained codified information about sea routes and landmarks. Viking longships were true masterpieces of naval engineering, designed specifically for the unique needs of the Norse people. These vessels were capable of navigating both the high seas and shallow rivers, allowing the Vikings to penetrate deep into the interior of continents through river systems. Building a longship was a communal endeavor that could take months or even years, involving specialized craftsmen whose skills were passed down from generation to generation. Each longship had its own personality and was often treated like a member of the family. By its owners, they were given elaborate names and decorated with intricate carvings that told stories of the crew's adventures. The ship's bow, often decorated with a dragon's head or other mythical creature, was considered to have protective powers and was treated with religious reverence. Life aboard a longship during long ocean voyages was brutal and challenging. The crew slept outdoors in all kinds of weather, subsisted on limited rations of salted meat and often stagnant water, and faced the constant danger of storms that could destroy the ship in minutes. However, the camaraderie developed during these voyages was intense, creating lifelong bonds between the men. Women also participated in some Viking sea voyages, especially during colonization expeditions. These women were chosen for their physical and mental strength, knowing they would face years of extreme hardship establishing new settlements in hostile lands. Their presence was essential to the long-term success of the colonies, as they brought the domestic skills needed to transform temporary camps into permanent communities. Viking settlements in foreign lands followed specific patterns that reflected both practical needs and cultural beliefs. The first building constructed was always a communal hall that served simultaneously as a social, religious, and defensive center. This hall was built according to specific architectural traditions that incorporated religious symbolism into the Structure itself, with supporting pillars carved to represent sacred trees and roofs designed to resemble the wings of ravens, birds associated with Odin. Around the main hall, other structures were gradually added: homes for individual families, workshops for artisans, stables for animals, and defensive structures. Each settlement also included a sacred space, often marked by special stones or trees that served as sites for religious rituals and legal assemblies. These spaces were considered neutral, where even enemies could meet without fear of violence. Viking agriculture was adapted to Scandinavia's extreme climate conditions and required specialized techniques to enable communities to survive the long Arctic winters. The Vikings developed advanced food preservation methods, including smoking, salting, and fermentation, which could keep meats and vegetables edible for months. They also practiced a rotational farming system that maintained soil fertility even in regions with extremely short growing seasons. Viking livestock were carefully selected for their cold hardiness and ability to survive on limited rations during the winter months. Viking horses were smaller but sturdier than their southern European counterparts, capable of carrying heavy loads through difficult terrain and surviving on poor pastures. Viking cattle developed particularly thick coats and could find food even under layers of snow. Viking craftsmanship represented the pinnacle of technical skill at the time, producing objects that combined superior functionality with extraordinary artistic beauty. Viking blacksmiths created weapons that were simultaneously deadly war tools and works of art, with Damascus patterns on the blades that were not only decorative, but also strengthened the metal. Jewelers produced intricate pieces using filigree, techniques that rivaled anything produced elsewhere in Europe. Viking woodcarvers were particularly skilled, creating everything from small amulets to massive pillars supporting halls that told complex stories through carved images. These sculptures were not merely decorative, but served as historical and religious records that preserved important cultural traditions. Each symbol and figure had a specific meaning that was understood by any member of Viking society. Education in Viking society was primarily oral and practical, with knowledge passed down from generation to generation through stories, songs, and practical demonstrations. Viking children learned the skills necessary for survival through direct participation in adult activities, starting with simple tasks and gradually taking on greater responsibilities. As they demonstrated competence, Viking boys began their military training at the age of 5 or 6, initially playing with wooden weapons and gradually progressing to real tools as they grew older. By the age of 12, they were expected to be proficient with swords, axes, spears, and bows. Girls learned not only traditional domestic skills, but also basic combat techniques, as they were expected to be able to defend their homes when the men were away on raids or trading voyages. The Viking legal system was surprisingly sophisticated, based on democratic assemblies known as things where free men could present disputes and vote on resolutions. These assemblies operated according to complex procedural rules that ensured that all sides of a dispute were heard before a decision was made. The concept of trial by jury, which would later become fundamental to modern legal systems, has its roots in these ancient Viking assemblies. Viking laws were memorized and recited by legal experts known as legsögumer, men who dedicated their lives to the study and preservation of legal traditions. These men were highly respected in society and often served as mediators in complex disputes. Their ability to accurately recall hundreds of legal precedents and apply them to specific situations was considered almost supernatural. Punishments in the Viking legal system ranged from monetary fines to permanent banishment, depending on the severity of the crime. Banishment was considered one of the most severe punishments, as it effectively sentenced the individual to death by removing all social and legal protections. Banished individuals became outlaws in the literal sense of the word, existing outside the protection of the law and able to be killed by anyone without legal consequences. Interestingly, the Viking legal system included specific provisions for the reintegration of criminals into society after serving their sentences. It was believed that most people could be reformed and that offering second chances was beneficial to the community. However, Particularly heinous crimes could result in permanent marks or mutilations that would identify the criminal for life. Viking medicine combined practical knowledge of herbs and surgery with supernatural beliefs about the causes of disease. Viking healers, often women known as like Jacona, possessed extensive knowledge of the medicinal properties of native plants and surgical techniques that were surprisingly advanced for the time. They could perform complex operations, including trepanation and fracture reduction, using specialized tools made specifically for medical purposes. However, many illnesses were attributed to supernatural causes, such as curses or the influence of evil spirits. Treatment for these conditions involved complex rituals, protective amulets, and invocations to specific deities associated with healing. The line between medicine and magic was often blurred, with healers serving as both physicians and priests. The Viking diet varied dramatically depending on the season and location, but generally included a surprising variety of foods. During the summer, Viking communities consumed fresh fruits, vegetables, and a wide variety of fish and seafood. In the winter, they relied primarily on preserved meats, stored grains, and fermented products. Beer was the staple drink for all ages, as the fermentation process made the water safer to drink. Viking feasts were important social events that served multiple functions beyond nutrition. They were opportunities to strengthen political alliances, celebrate military and religious successes, and demonstrate wealth and status. During these feasts, the halls of Viking leaders became centers of cultural activity where skalds recited epic poems, musicians played traditional instruments, and stories were shared, preserving the community's oral history. Viking music included both work songs that helped coordinate labor activities and complex pieces for entertainment and religious rituals. Instruments included harps, bone flutes, drums, and horns that could produce sounds audible over great distances. Some Viking songs were specifically designed to be sung during long sea voyages, helping to maintain crew morale and coordinate the work required to operate the ship. Viking games and sports served as both entertainment and practical skills training. Wrestling, stone lifting, and racing competitions tested physical strength and endurance, while board games like Nefatafel developed strategic skills useful in both war and business. These games were taken very seriously, with important competitions attracting spectators from great distances and substantial prizes for the winners. During the long winter months, when outdoor activities were limited, the Vikings devoted themselves to artistic and craft activities. It was during these periods that the finest weapons, jewelry, and art objects were created, as artisans had time to dedicate themselves fully to their work. Entire families participated in the production of textiles, with each member contributing according to their skills and age. Viking clothing was practical, but also reflected social status and regional identity. Fabrics were dyed using natural dyes that produced vibrant colors, and important pieces were decorated with intricate embroidery or precious metal applications. The quality and complexity of a person's clothing immediately indicated their position in society, with leaders wearing imported fabrics and elaborate decorations that demonstrated their wealth and trade connections. The Viking concept of honor was central to all social interaction and influenced every aspect of daily life. Honor was not simply a matter of personal reputation, but a tangible social capital that affected a person's ability to do business, form marital alliances, and even receive legal protection. Losing honor was considered worse than death, as it condemned not only the individual, but potentially their entire family to a marginalized existence. Honor could be earned through courageous acts, generosity, skill in combat, or business wisdom. However, it could also be quickly lost through cowardice, betrayal, breaking oaths, or failing to avenge injustices committed against one's family. The system was complex and nuanced, with different actions having different honor values depending on the specific circumstances in which they occurred. One of the most fascinating traditions related to honor was the concept of nigh, a form of magical dishonor that could be inflicted through specific rituals and elaborate insults. Nigh was believed to have real power to cause misfortune and social degradation, making it a potent weapon in personal disputes. Night practices included the creation of carved curse posts, the composition of special satirical verses, and rituals that symbolically emasculated or degraded the target. Revenge was not only accepted in Viking society, but often mandatory. Failure to avenge a dead relative or a significant injustice was seen as cowardice and resulted in a substantial loss of honor. However, revenge followed specific and proportional rules. Killing someone in revenge for a minor insult would be considered excessive and would result in legal consequences. The system created a delicate balance where violence was controlled through complex social expectations. The Viking sagas that have survived to us are only a fraction of the stories, originally preserved orally by generations of storytellers. These narratives were not simply entertainment, but served as repositories of legal, historical, and cultural knowledge. Each saga contained lessons on appropriate behavior, consequences of different actions, and examples of how to navigate complex social situations. Saga narrators developed sophisticated mnemonic techniques that allowed them to remember stories that took hours or even days to tell in their entirety. They used rhythmic patterns, structural repetitions, and vivid visual images to anchor details in memory. Accuracy was crucial, as unauthorized changes to the stories could alter their legal or religious meanings. A particularly intriguing tradition was that of the landnamsmen, the early settlers who claimed virgin lands in new territories. These men followed specific rituals to establish legal ownership, including carrying sacred fire from their homelands and performing ceremonies that connected the new land to the ancestral gods. The process was not simply practical, but deeply spiritual, establishing a mystical connection between the settler, the land, and their ancestors. Landnamsmen often faced challenges that tested not only their physical courage, but also their ingenuity and adaptability. New lands could contain unfamiliar dangers, from predators to extreme weather conditions that differed dramatically from their previous experiences. Success required not only careful planning, but also the ability to improvise solutions to unexpected problems. Interactions between Vikings and the native peoples of the lands they colonized varied dramatically depending on multiple factors, including the attitudes of the natives, the resources available in the region, and the specific goals of the Viking colonizers. Some interactions resulted in mutually beneficial trade and even intermarriage, while others led to violent conflict and displacement of the native populations. Interestingly, many Vikings who settled permanently in foreign lands eventually adopted aspects of the local cultures, creating hybrid societies that combined Norse traditions with native practices. These cultural developments were especially pronounced in Ireland, England, and France, where Viking communities gradually integrated into the local populations over several generations. Viking religiosity underwent significant changes during the expansion period, especially when Viking communities came into contact with Christianity. Conversion was not a simple or uniform process, with many Vikings adopting a syncretic approach that incorporated Christian elements into their traditional beliefs. This religious fusion created unique practices that were neither completely pagan nor completely Christian. Some Vikings became nominal Christians for political or commercial reasons, secretly maintaining their traditional beliefs. Others genuinely embraced the new faith but interpreted Christian teachings through a Norse cultural lens, resulting in versions of Christianity that were distinctly Scandinavian. This process of religious syncretism created traditions that persisted for centuries. After the official conversion of Norse societies, the decline of the Viking Age was not abrupt, but a gradual process that occurred over several centuries. Multiple factors contributed to this transition, including political centralization in Scandinavia, the strengthening of defenses in lands previously targeted by Viking raids, and economic changes that made trade more profitable than plunder. As Scandinavian kingdoms became more centralized and organized, kings gained greater control over their subjects' activities, including the ability to regulate or prohibit independent raiding expeditions. This centralization gradually eliminated the political conditions that had made the classical Viking Age possible, transforming independent warriors into subjects of organized states. Simultaneously, European societies that had been victims of Viking raids developed more effective defenses and early warning systems that made surprise attacks more difficult. Improved fortifications, standing armies, and defensive alliances significantly reduced the success of traditional Viking expeditions, making them less economically attractive. Climate change also played a role in the Viking decline. The medieval warm period that had facilitated ocean navigation and agriculture in marginal regions began to give way to colder conditions that made some Viking activities less viable. The gradual isolation of colonies like Greenland was partly a result of these climate changes. However, the Viking legacy persisted long beyond the formal end of the Viking Age. Legal traditions, maritime practices, artistic techniques, and cultural elements that originated in Viking society influenced the subsequent development of all of Northern Europe. Many of the characteristics we associate with modern Scandinavian societies can be traced back to traditions established during the Viking Age. The Vikings' linguistic influence was particularly lasting, with thousands of words of Old Norse origin remaining in use in the modern languages of England, Ireland, France, and other regions where the Vikings settled. These words are not limited to terms related to warfare or navigation, but include basic vocabulary related to everyday life, demonstrating the depth of Viking cultural integration. Perhaps most significantly, the Vikings set precedents for ocean exploration, international trade, and colonization that influenced later developments in European history. Their trade routes connected previously isolated regions. Their navigational techniques were adopted and refined by later sailors, and their methods of establishing colonies in distant lands provided models for future European expansion. Modern fascination with Viking culture reflects not only historical interest, but also an appreciation for aspects of their society that resonate with contemporary values. The Viking emphasis on individual courage, legal equality, women's rights, and democratic governance through popular assemblies anticipated developments that only became widely accepted much later in European history. However, it's important to remember that our understanding of Viking culture continues to evolve as new archaeological discoveries and advances in historical analysis techniques reveal previously unknown aspects of their societies. Many of the stories we tell about the Vikings are based on limited sources and may not fully reflect the complexity and diversity of ancient Norse cultures. What remains consistent is that the Vikings represented a unique cultural phenomenon that combined exceptional seafaring skill, social flexibility, artistic creativity, and physical courage in a way that allowed them to influence the course of European history far beyond what their relatively small numbers would suggest. Their stories continue to fascinate us because they capture something fundamental about the human experience: the desire to explore the unknown, challenge limitations, and create meaning through courageous action. When we imagine what it would be like to live as a Viking Berserker or any other member of this extraordinary society, we are truly exploring timeless questions about courage, identity, community, and what it means to live a meaningful life. The answers the Vikings gave to these questions may have been specific to their time and place, but the questions themselves remain relevant for all of us seeking to understand our own place in the world and how we can live with purpose and integrity. Thus, the stories of Viking berserkers, traders, sailors, warriors, and craftsmen are not only compelling historical accounts, but windows into diverse ways of being human that can inspire and inform our own journeys through life in a world that often seems dominated by forces beyond our individual control. Viking stories remind us that courageous and determined individuals can still shape their own destiny and leave lasting marks on the world.